Sir, I'm sorry. I think I texted the wrong number, but my baby sister hasn't eaten in 2 days. The message appeared on a screen surrounded by glass walls and quiet power, cutting through a room where numbers ruled everything and emotions had long been priced out. High above Manhattan, in a penthouse that seemed to float above the city lights, James Whitmore stood at the head of a table made of cold Italian marble, his reflection faint beneath projections of a nine-figure deal. Men in tailored suits spoke in measured tones about margins and acquisitions, their voices blending into a low, polished hum, the kind that never faltered, never broke. The air smelled faintly of leather and citrus polish, a curated perfection where nothing unexpected ever entered uninvited. And yet, there it was. A single text. No subject line. No introduction. Just a quiet plea that didn't belong in a world of calculated precision. Across the city, miles below the glow of that glass tower, Lily Carter sat on the edge of a worn-out couch in a one-bedroom apartment where silence felt heavier than sound. The heater clicked but gave no warmth, and the faint buzz of a flickering kitchen light painted everything in a tired yellow haze. In her arms, wrapped in a thin blanket that had been washed too many times, her baby sister whimpered softly, a small, fragile sound that felt louder than anything in the world. Lily adjusted the bottle in her hand, tilting it gently, hoping for a drop that wouldn't come. Empty. Again. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Not when the electricity had almost been shut off. Not when her mom came home late, shoulders slumped, smelling like bleach and exhaustion. And not tonight. Because tonight, there wasn't time for tears. Only decisions. Her name was Lily Carter. 10 years old. Old enough to understand what hunger sounded like. Old enough to recognize the look in her mother's eyes when there were no more answers left to give. Sarah Carter had left early that morning, promising she would figure something out. She always said that, and most days she did. But today had been different. Today, she had come home with nothing but silence. No groceries. No formula. Just a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a quiet, "We'll manage, honey." But Lily had seen the truth. She always did. So when the night stretched longer and her baby sister's cries grew weaker instead of louder, Lily made a choice that didn't feel like a child's choice at all. She reached for her mother's old phone, the one with a cracked corner and a battery that barely held on, and opened a message thread she barely understood. Numbers. Just numbers. Somewhere in those numbers, she thought, there had to be help. She typed slowly, carefully, each word carrying more weight than her small hands should have to hold. She didn't know who she was sending it to. She didn't know if anyone would answer. She only knew she had to try. And somewhere far above her world of peeling paint and empty cupboards, a man who had built an empire on certainty stared at that message as if it were written in a language he had forgotten how to read. James Whitmore didn't deal in accidents. He didn't believe in chance. Every call, every meeting, every move in his life had been intentional, calculated, controlled. But this wasn't part of any plan. He should have ignored it, deleted it, moved on. That was what men like him did. That was how they stayed where they were. But his thumb hovered over the screen longer than it should have. The room around him blurred into background noise, voices fading into something distant and unimportant. Because for a moment, just a moment, the glass walls around him didn't feel like protection. They felt like distance. Distance from something real, something raw, something he hadn't felt in years. And without fully understanding why, James Whitmore sat down in a room where no one ever sat during a deal, stared at a message that wasn't meant for him, and realized that sometimes the smallest mistake could reach the highest places and refuse to be ignored. The room did not notice when James Whitmore stopped listening, because rooms like that were never built to notice anything human. Only movement, only profit, only the subtle shifts of power between men who believed they controlled everything they saw. But at the head of the table, something had changed, something small and almost invisible, the kind of change that did not announce itself with sound but with stillness. And for the first time in years, James was not calculating outcomes. He was reading words that did not belong in his world, words that did not negotiate, did not persuade, did not impress. They simply existed, fragile and unpolished, and that made them impossible to ignore. His phone rested in his hand heavier than it should have been, as if the weight of that single message had altered its gravity. My baby sister hasn't eaten in 2 days. He read it again, slower this time, as though the meaning might shift if he looked carefully enough. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same, direct, unembellished, real. Across the city, Lily adjusted the thin blanket again, tucking it around the small body in her arms with a care that came from watching her mother do the same thing 100 times. Her baby sister's cries had softened into quiet whimpers, the kind that came not from sudden discomfort, but from something deeper, something emptier. Lily leaned forward slightly, her forehead almost touching the baby's, whispering softly, even though she knew the words did not change anything. "It is okay. I am here," her voice steady in a way that did not belong to someone her age. The apartment around her held its silence like a held breath. The refrigerator hummed faintly, but offered nothing. The cabinet stood closed but already answered, empty. She glanced once toward the door as if expecting her mother to walk in with a solution. But the hallway outside remained still. Time stretched in that room differently, slower, heavier, each minute carrying more weight than the last. Back in the penthouse, one of the executives cleared his throat, a polite interruption that signaled impatience wrapped in professionalism. "Mr. Whitmore, should we proceed with the acquisition summary?" The voice was careful, measured, practiced. But James did not respond immediately, because in that moment the word acquisition felt distant, abstract, almost meaningless compared to a sentence written by a child who did not know what the word meant but understood need in its purest form. He placed the phone gently on the table, not dismissively, but deliberately, as if setting something down that required attention rather than avoidance. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him, thousands of windows glowing with lives he had never needed to consider, lives that existed beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He had built his success on distance, on the ability to separate himself from anything that could not be measured or predicted. And yet here it was, something unpredictable, something inconvenient, something undeniably real. His mind moved the way it always did, searching for context, for explanation, for logic. Was it a scam, a mistake, a coincidence? The number was unfamiliar, the message unverified. Every instinct he had developed over decades told him to disregard it, to move forward, to return to the conversation that waited patiently for his authority. But another voice, quieter and far less practiced, lingered just beneath the surface, not loud enough to command, but persistent enough to remain, a memory not fully formed, a feeling rather than a thought. Something about the way the words were written, the absence of demand, the apology at the beginning, as if the sender already expected to be ignored. James leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting not toward the projections but toward nothing in particular. And in that pause, something unfamiliar settled in. Not urgency, not panic, but recognition. Across the city, Lily shifted again, reaching for the phone she had set beside her, its dim screen reflecting faintly in the low light. She stared at it for a moment, waiting, hoping. Even though she did not know what she was waiting for, she had done what she could, said what she needed to say, and now there was only silence, the kind of silence that could mean anything or nothing at all. Her fingers hovered near the screen but did not touch it, as if afraid that checking would confirm what she already suspected, that no one was coming, that no one had seen, that her message had disappeared into the same emptiness that surrounded her. She swallowed quietly, steadying herself the way she had learned to do, not because it made things easier, but because it made them possible. Back in the penthouse, James reached for the phone again, this time not as a distraction, but as a decision. His thumb moved slowly across the screen, not typing yet, not responding, just holding the moment a second longer, because something about it felt irreversible, as though whatever he chose next would not simply answer a message, but change the direction of something he had not realized was still capable of changing. And in a world where he controlled almost everything, the uncertainty of that realization was the one thing he could not ignore. James Whitmore had built his life on speed, on decisions made in seconds that moved millions of dollars and reshaped entire industries. But now his thumb hovered over a simple reply field as if time itself had slowed around it, the cursor blinking patiently, waiting for something more human than any message he had sent in years. Across the table, someone shifted papers. Another voice began explaining projections again, but their words no longer reached him. They dissolved into a distant murmur. Because for the first time in a long time he was not thinking about what a decision would gain him, he was thinking about what it might mean. He exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, then typed, "Are you safe right now?" The message was short, direct, but unlike anything he usually sent. No negotiation, no agenda, no strategy, just a question. He stared at it for half a second longer before pressing send. The message disappeared, and with it something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Miles away, Lily felt the faint vibration before she saw the light. Her eyes dropped instantly to the phone, her breath catching not out of excitement, but out of disbelief, because she had not expected anything. Not really. She opened the message slowly, as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. Her eyes scanned the words once, then again, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the device. Someone had answered, not with money, not with dismissal, but with a question. She hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure of who was on the other side. But the warmth of being seen, even by a stranger, filled the room in a way the heater could not. She adjusted her sister carefully, then typed back with the same care she had used before. "Yes, sir. We are at home. I am sorry I texted you. I thought this was a help number." She paused, then added, "I did not mean to bother you," and sent it. Her message felt small the moment it left, like a whisper in a large, empty space, but it carried everything she had. Back in the penthouse, James read her reply instantly, his jaw tightening slightly at the apology, not because it offended him, but because it revealed something deeper, a child apologizing for asking for help. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the marble table, no longer aware of the meeting still technically happening around him. The polished room now felt like a stage he had stepped away from without physically moving. He typed again, slower this time, choosing each word with a precision that had nothing to do with business. "You are not bothering me. What is your name?" He sent it without overthinking, and for the first time in years he did not consider how the message would be received in a professional context. Because this was not professional, it was personal in a way that bypassed all the systems he had built to protect himself from exactly this kind of moment. Lily read the new message, her eyes softening slightly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "My name is Lily Carter," she typed. Then, after a brief hesitation, "My baby sister is Emma." She looked down at the small face resting against her arm, the faint rise and fall of breathing steady but fragile. She added one more line, not because she wanted to ask again, but because she felt she needed to explain. "We just need formula. I can try to find something tomorrow." She pressed send before she could reconsider. The phone slipped back into her lap, and she waited again, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, but uncertain in a way that held possibility. James read the message and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the ceiling for a moment, as if searching for something beyond the polished surface of his world. Lily Carter. He repeated the name silently, letting it settle, letting it become real, not a concept, not a case, but a person, a child sitting somewhere in the same city, holding responsibility that should never belong to her. He looked around the room, at the suits, the screens, the quiet expectation that he would return to the agenda at any moment. And for the first time, the entire environment felt strangely disconnected from what mattered. He reached for his jacket draped over the back of the chair, a subtle movement that drew a few confused glances. "Continue without me," he said calmly, his voice steady but final, the kind of tone that did not invite questions. And without waiting for a response, he stepped away from the table, away from the numbers, away from the carefully controlled world he had mastered, his phone still in his hand, the last message glowing faintly on the screen. Not a business opportunity, not a risk assessment, just a name. Lily Carter, and a quiet need that had found its way into his life without permission, and for once, he did not try to control it, he chose to follow it. The elevator doors closed with a soft, controlled hush, sealing James Whitmore away from the world he had just stepped out of, but not from the decision he had already made. His reflection stared back at him in the polished steel, not distorted, not unclear, but unfamiliar in a way he could not immediately explain. He adjusted his cuff out of habit, though there was no one left to notice. And for the first time that evening, his mind was not racing ahead to outcomes or contingencies. It was anchored, present, fixed on a small apartment somewhere in the same city where a 10-year-old girl was holding her family together with nothing but quiet determination. His phone vibrated again, a new message. "It is okay if you cannot help. I understand." Lily had written, the words simple, almost gentle, as if she was trying to make it easier for him to walk away. James exhaled slowly. That single line carrying more weight than any demand ever could, because it removed obligation and replaced it with choice, and choice was something he had always valued, but rarely questioned. Until now, outside the building the night air carried a crisp chill, the kind that sharpened everything it touched. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, lights flickering like distant signals, thousands of stories unfolding at once, most of them unseen, most of them unheard. His driver stepped forward immediately, opening the rear door of a black car that blended seamlessly into the quiet luxury of the street. "Home, sir?" the man asked, his voice respectful, automatic. But James paused, just slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the door, because home suddenly felt like the wrong direction, not incorrect, but incomplete. He glanced down at his phone again, at the name that had no last history, no profile, no background, just a child and a need. "No," he said calmly, his voice steady. "We are making a stop first." The driver nodded without question, closing the door as James slid into the seat. The interior wrapped him in familiar comfort, soft leather, controlled temperature, silence that felt intentional. But tonight it did not isolate him the way it usually did. It focused him. "Find the nearest open grocery store," James added, his tone still composed, but carrying something new beneath it, something quieter, more deliberate. "Yes, sir." The car moved smoothly into the flow of traffic, merging into a city that never slowed, never waited. But somehow tonight, it felt like it had made space. Across town Lily shifted, slightly, her back aching in a way she ignored, her eyes fixed on the phone in her lap. She had not expected another message, not after the last one, not after she had given him an easy way out, because that was what people usually took, the easy way. She adjusted Emma gently, brushing a strand of soft hair from her face, whispering again even though her sister was too tired to respond. The room around them remained unchanged, still, quiet, heavy with the absence of what they needed, but something inside Lily had shifted, not hope exactly, but a small, steady feeling that she was not completely alone in that moment. Her phone remained silent, and yet she did not feel the same emptiness she had felt before, because someone had read her words, someone had answered, and that alone had changed something she could not fully name. The car came to a smooth stop outside a brightly lit grocery store, its wide glass windows revealing aisles stocked with everything a person could need, or think they needed. James stepped out without hesitation, the automatic doors sliding open as he approached, a rush of warm air greeting him, filled with the scent of fresh bread and packaged abundance. He paused, for just a fraction of a second, taking in the contrast, shelves lined neatly with options, choices stacked in rows, a quiet kind of wealth that existed in plain sight, unnoticed by most, but overwhelming when seen through a different lens. He moved through the aisles with purpose, not browsing, not considering, but selecting. Formula, the kind designed for sensitive infants, extra supplies, bottles, wipes, anything that might ease a burden he was only beginning to understand. He did not check prices, did not hesitate, because for the first time the numbers did not matter. Only the outcome did. At the register the cashier scanned the items with routine efficiency, unaware of the shift taking place beyond the ordinary transaction. James reached into his pocket, then paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the items, then to his phone. Lily Carter. He read the name again, grounding himself in the reality of what he was about to do. Not a donation, not a gesture for recognition, but a direct answer to a quiet plea. He completed the purchase, gathered the bags himself without waiting for assistance, and walked back out into the night, the cool air meeting him again. But now it carried something different, something purposeful. He opened his phone once more and typed, "I am on my way. Can you tell me your address?" And as he sent the message, the distance between two completely different worlds began to close, not through chance, not through coincidence, but through a decision that refused to remain theoretical. And somewhere in a small, dim apartment, a phone would soon light up again. carrying with it more than words, carrying with it the first real sign that help was no longer just an idea, but something already in motion. The message arrived like a spark in a dark room, small but impossible to ignore. Lily's phone lit up in her hands, and for a moment she did not move, as if even breathing too quickly might make it disappear, her eyes fixed on the screen, reading the words once, then again. I am on my way. Can you tell me your address? Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone, her heart beating faster not from fear, but from something unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself to feel all night. Possibility, she swallowed quietly, glancing toward the door again, then back to her baby sister whose breathing had grown softer, steadier but fragile. It is okay, Lily whispered again, though this time the words carried a different weight. She shifted carefully, reaching for a piece of paper on the small table beside her, the address written in her careful handwriting from when her mother had made her memorize it, just in case. Always just in case, she typed slowly, making sure every number was correct, every letter clear. We live at 314 West Elm Street, apartment 2B. She paused, then added, "Thank you, sir." Before sending it, her thumb lingered on the screen for a second longer, as if trying to hold on to the moment. Then she placed the phone beside her and waited, but this time the waiting did not feel empty. It felt like something was moving toward her. Somewhere across the city, the black car cut through traffic with quiet precision, headlights reflecting off wet pavement. The city alive in its usual rhythm, unaware of the small story unfolding within it. James sat in the back seat, the grocery bags beside him, his phone resting in his hand as he read the address. West Elm Street, a part of the city he had not visited in years, not because he avoided it, but because his life had slowly narrowed into places that looked the same: glass, steel, controlled environments where unpredictability was managed, not encountered. How long? He asked calmly, his eyes still on the screen. The driver glanced at the navigation briefly. About 12 minutes, sir. James nodded once. 12 minutes, a short distance measured in time, but a much larger one measured in experience. He leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting to the passing streets, storefronts, people moving along sidewalks, each one carrying something unseen, something unspoken, and for the first time in a long time, he was not observing it as background, but as reality, something that existed whether he chose to notice it or not. The car slowed as it turned onto a narrower street, the buildings older, closer together, the lights dimmer, less curated, more honest in their wear. James sat forward slightly now, his attention sharpened, not out of concern, but out of awareness. The driver eased the car to a stop in front of a modest apartment building, its brick exterior worn but standing, a single light flickering above the entrance. "We are here, sir." James nodded, reaching for the bags without hesitation, stepping out into the cooler air, the contrast immediate. No doorman, no polished entryway, just a quiet building holding quiet lives. He approached the door, the handle cool beneath his hand as he pulled it open, the hallway inside narrow, the air carrying a faint mix of detergent and time. Apartment 2B, he moved with purpose but without urgency, each step deliberate, grounded, until he stood in front of a simple door, his hand raised, pausing for a brief moment before knocking, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that what waited on the other side was not a transaction. It was a moment that could not be undone. Inside the apartment, Lily heard the knock and froze, her breath catching as her eyes moved slowly toward the door. For a second the room seemed to hold still, every sound fading into silence. She gently adjusted Emma, laying her carefully on the couch before standing, her small steps quiet but steady as she approached the door, her hand hovering just above the handle, the memory of her mother's voice echoing softly in her mind. "Be careful. Always be careful." Lily took a slow breath, then turned the handle and opened the door just slightly, enough to see, enough to know. And there he was, not a voice on a phone, not a distant stranger, but a man standing in the hallway holding bags that carried more than groceries. Their eyes met for the first time, and in that quiet space between them, something unspoken passed, not gratitude yet, not relief yet, but recognition that two completely different worlds had just found the same doorway at the same moment, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. For a moment, neither of them spoke. the hallway light casting a soft glow between them as if it understood the weight of the moment better than either of them did. Lily's small hand still holding the edge of the door, her eyes searching his face not for status or wealth, but for intention, because children like her learned early that not every adult who showed up was there to help. And James Whitmore, a man who had spent his life being immediately recognized, stood there almost anonymous, not because he had changed, but because in this space none of that mattered. He lowered his gaze slightly, softening his posture in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. "Hi, Lily," he said gently, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Careful not to fill the space too quickly, Lily blinked once, surprised not just that he knew her name, but that he said it like it mattered. She opened the door a little wider, stepping back just enough to let him see inside, the apartment revealing itself. Without apology, the worn couch, the dim light, the quiet signs of a life held together with effort rather than ease. James did not hesitate, did not comment, did not react with the subtle discomfort many would have shown. He simply stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, the bag still in his hands, his presence filling the small space not with pressure, but with something steadier, something grounded. Lily turned immediately toward the couch, instinct guiding her back to what mattered most. "This is Emma," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper as she reached down to adjust the blanket again. James followed her gaze, his eyes settling on the small figure, the rise and fall of the baby's chest, the quiet stillness that spoke louder than any cry could. Something in his expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough, the kind of shift that happens when something abstract becomes real, when a problem becomes a person. He moved closer, placing the bags gently on the small table, careful not to make noise, as if the room itself required respect. "I brought some formula," he said, his voice low, not as an announcement, but as reassurance. Lily's eyes moved quickly to the bags, then back to him, disbelief flickering across her face before she stepped forward, her movements quick but controlled. She opened one of the bags, her hands pausing for just a second. When she saw it, the familiar container, sealed, full, real, she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Not a gasp, not a cry, just a quiet release. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but steady. And in that moment those two words carried more meaning than any contract James had ever signed. He nodded once, not dismissing it, but accepting it in a way that felt appropriate, not as a transaction, but as a shared understanding. Lily moved quickly now, her focus returning to Emma, her hands steady as she prepared the bottle with the precision of someone who had done it many times before, the water measured carefully, the formula mixed gently, no wasted motion, no hesitation. James watched quietly, not interfering, not offering instruction, simply observing the quiet competence of a child who had been asked to grow up too soon. The room seemed to shift as the soft sound of feeding replaced the earlier silence. Emma's small movements, the subtle signs of comfort, returning, the kind that could not be forced, only restored. Lily sat back down, holding her sister carefully, her posture relaxing just slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way that made her look younger again, more like the child she was supposed to be. James remained standing for a moment, then slowly took a seat on the edge of a nearby chair, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by presence. He glanced around briefly, taking in the details not with judgment, but with awareness, the small stack of bills on the table, the worn edges of furniture, the quiet evidence of effort. "Is your mom home?" he asked gently, not as an interrogation, but as concern. Lily shook her head softly, her eyes still on Emma. "She is working. She said she would be back later." Her voice carried a quiet confidence. "Not worry, because worrying would not help." James nodded, understanding more than the words themselves conveyed. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, his gaze returning to Lily. And for the first time in years he was not thinking about what came next in terms of strategy or outcome, but in terms of responsibility, not imposed, not expected, but chosen, because standing in that small apartment, watching a 10-year-old care for her baby sister with quiet strength, he realized that some moments do not ask for permission. They simply ask for presence, and what he chose to do next would define not just the outcome of this night, but the meaning of everything that had led him to this door. The apartment settled into a quieter rhythm as Emma drank slowly, the soft, steady motion replacing the earlier tension that had filled every corner of the room. And for the first time that night, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt gentle, like something that was finally allowed to rest. Lily adjusted her hold carefully, her small hands supporting her sister with a confidence that came from necessity rather than choice. And across from her, James Whitmore watched without interrupting, without offering advice, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to improve, only something to witness, the kind of strength that did not announce itself but revealed itself in quiet, repeated actions. He leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes moving once more around the room, noticing details he might have overlooked before: a folded school worksheet tucked under a book, a jacket hanging neatly by the door, a pair of shoes lined up with care, small signs of order maintained in a life that offered very little control. "You take very good care of her," he said softly, his voice measured, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Lily glanced up briefly, her expression calm, almost matter of fact. "She needs me," she replied, as if that explained everything. And in many ways it did. James nodded once, letting the words settle, because they carried a truth he had spent years forgetting, that sometimes responsibility is not assigned, it is simply accepted. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, marking time that no longer felt urgent, just present, until the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the soft rattle of keys against the door. Lily's head turned instantly, her body straightening slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. "That is my mom," she said quietly, and for the first time since he had entered the apartment, James felt a shift, not uncertainty, but awareness that this moment was about to expand. The door opened slowly, and Sarah Carter stepped inside, her shoulders slightly slumped from the weight of a long day, her coat worn but clean, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested more urgency than style. She closed the door behind her, turning halfway before her eyes landed on something unexpected: a man sitting in her living room, her daughter beside him, and for a fraction of a second, everything in her posture tightened, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the instinct of someone who had learned to protect what little she had. "Lily," she said carefully, her voice controlled but edged with concern. "Who is this?" Lily stood immediately, her movements quick but not frantic. "Mom, it is okay," she said gently, stepping closer. "He is the one who texted me back." Sarah's gaze shifted to James, studying him not with recognition, but with evaluation, her eyes moving from his face to the bags on the table, then to the bottle in Emma's hands, already half empty. And something in her expression changed, not completely, but enough to soften the edge. James stood slowly, keeping his movements calm, deliberate, giving her space rather than closing it. "My name is James," he said simply, not adding titles, not offering explanations that would complicate what did not need to be complicated. "Your daughter reached out tonight." Sarah looked at Lily again, confusion and realization passing quickly across her face. "You sent a message?" she asked quietly. Lily nodded once, her expression steady, not ashamed, not defensive, just honest. "I thought it was a help number," she explained. "I did not know it was him." Sarah exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both surprise and something deeper, something closer to relief. She stepped further into the room, placing her bag down with a quiet thud, her eyes returning to James, this time with less suspicion and more understanding. "You came all the way here," she said, not as a question, but as a statement she was still processing. James nodded once. "She said your baby had not eaten," he replied, his tone even, not dramatic, just factual. Sarah's eyes flickered briefly, the reality of the situation settling in again, but this time without the same weight, because the outcome had changed. She moved closer to the couch, her hand gently touching Emma's head, feeling the difference immediately, the calm, the warmth, the absence of distress. And in that moment something in her shoulders eased, something she had been holding all day without realizing it. She looked back at Lily, then at James, her voice quieter now, steadier. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but full, not just for the formula, but for the presence, for the interruption of a night that had been heading in a very different direction. James inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude without amplifying it, because he understood that what mattered was not the gesture itself, but what it represented, a shift, a connection, a moment where two lives that should never have crossed had done so in a way that could not be undone. And as the room settled once more, no longer divided by uncertainty, but united by something quieter, something more human, it became clear that this was no longer just about a message sent by mistake. It was about what happens when someone chooses to answer anyway, and what that choice can change long after the moment has passed. The room no longer felt like a place holding struggle. It felt like a place that had just been given room to breathe, and that change was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable. Sarah moved slowly to sit beside Lily, her hand resting gently on Emma, as if confirming again that this moment was real, that the soft, steady rhythm of her baby's breathing was not something fragile or temporary anymore, but something restored, something safe for now. She glanced once more at the bags on the table, then at James, her expression thoughtful, measuring not what he had brought, but what it meant that he had come at all. "You did not have to do this," she said quietly, not as a rejection, but as recognition of the distance between their worlds. James met her gaze calmly, his posture relaxed but present. "I know," he replied simply, and in that answer, there was no explanation, no justification, just truth, because what had brought him here was not obligation, but choice, and that made all the difference. Lily watched the exchange silently, her small frame leaning slightly into her mother now, the tension that had held her upright all night finally easing, allowing her to be a child again, even if only for a moment. The clock continued its quiet ticking, but now time felt different, less like something slipping away and more like something being given back. James glanced at the small stack of bills on the table again. The overdue notices, the quiet reminders of a life lived on the edge of stability, and he understood without asking that this night was not an isolated problem. It was part of something larger, something ongoing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still measured, careful not to disrupt the fragile sense of calm that had settled in the room. "How long has it been like this?" he asked, not as an intrusion, but as an attempt to understand. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes moving briefly to Lily, then back to him, deciding in that instant whether to protect her story or to tell it honestly. "Long enough," she answered, her tone steady but carrying the weight of more than just days or weeks. "I work 2 jobs, but it is never quite enough. Something always comes up, rent, medicine, things you cannot plan for." She paused, her hand brushing lightly over Emma's blanket. "And sometimes, you just run out of time before you run out of need." James listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something behind it shifting, aligning, the abstract concept of hardship becoming specific, detailed, undeniable. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because understanding did not fix the problem, but it was where any real change had to begin. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone, not with the detachment of earlier, but with intention. He typed briefly, then placed it back down, not drawing attention to the action, but allowing it to become part of the moment. "Tomorrow morning," he said calmly, "someone will come by with more supplies, enough for a while. Not just formula, everything you might need." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in cautious disbelief, the kind that comes from hearing promises that sound too easy, too immediate. "You do not have to do that," she said again, softer this time, not refusing, but unsure how to accept something so far outside her experience. James shook his head gently. "This is not about what I have to do," he replied, his voice steady. "It is about what I can do." The distinction settled quietly in the room, simple but powerful, because it reframed everything. Lily looked between them, her eyes thoughtful, absorbing not just the words, but the meaning behind them. The idea that help did not always come with conditions, that sometimes it simply arrived. The apartment, once defined by scarcity, now held something new, not abundance, not yet, but possibility. And that was enough to change how the air felt, how the silence sounded. Sarah exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release something she had been holding for far longer than just this evening. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now, not just grateful, but grounded, as if she was allowing herself, for the first time in a long while, to believe that tomorrow might look different than today. James nodded once more, not seeking acknowledgement, not expanding the moment beyond what it needed to be, because he understood that the true impact of what had just happened would not be measured in this room, but in the days that followed, in the quiet ways a life could shift when given even a small amount of support at the right time. And as he stood to leave, the room did not feel smaller. Without him, it felt changed, as if something had been set in motion that would continue long after the door closed. Something that had begun with a single message sent by mistake, but had become something far more intentional, something that proved that even in a city full of distance, connection could still find its way through, if someone was willing to answer when it mattered most. The door closed softly behind James Whitmore, but the silence he left behind was no longer the same silence that had filled the apartment before he arrived. It carried something new, something steadier, as if the walls themselves had witnessed a shift they would not forget. Sarah stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where he had been sitting, her eyes fixed on the door not because she expected him to return, but because she was trying to understand what had just happened, how a single unexpected moment had interrupted a night that had felt impossible only hours before. Lily remained seated on the couch, Emma now sleeping peacefully in her arms, the small bottle resting empty on the table beside her, a quiet symbol of something restored, something that had nearly been lost. She looked down at her sister, brushing her fingers gently across her soft hair, her expression calm, but her eyes thoughtful, absorbing everything, the knock, the voice, the presence, the change. Sarah finally moved, stepping closer, lowering herself onto the couch beside Lily, their shoulders touching lightly, grounding each other in a way that required no words. "You did a brave thing," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying both pride and something deeper, something close to humility. Lily shook her head slightly, her gaze still on Emma. "I just did what we needed," she replied. And in that quiet answer was the essence of who she was, not someone seeking attention, not someone expecting reward, just someone who understood responsibility in its purest form. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hand reaching to gently cover Lily's, squeezing it once, as if to say everything she could not fully express. Across the city, the car carried James back through streets that looked different. Now, not because they had changed, but because he had. The glass buildings he passed no longer felt like symbols of success alone. They felt like distance he had accepted for years without question. He leaned back in the seat, his phone resting in his hand once again. But this time the screen was dark, no message waiting, no deal unfolding, just the quiet aftermath of a choice that had not been calculated, only made. His reflection in the window looked the same as it always had, composed, controlled, but something beneath it had shifted, something quieter, more grounded. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to hold on to the clarity of the moment before it could be replaced by routine, because he understood now that moments like that did not arrive often, and when they did, they asked something simple and difficult at the same time: to be seen and to be answered. The next morning arrived with a different kind of light filtering through the small apartment. Window, softer, warmer, not because the sun had changed, but because the room it entered had. Lily woke first, as she always did, her movements quiet. Careful not to disturb Emma, she sat up slowly, her eyes moving instinctively to the table, to the bag still there, real, unchanged, proof that the night before had not been something imagined or temporary. She reached out, touching one of the containers lightly, grounding herself in its presence. Sarah stirred soon after, her eyes opening too. The same sight, the same reminder. And for a moment she simply watched her daughter, the way Lily moved, the way she checked on Emma, the way she carried herself with a strength that had never been asked for but had always been given. A knock sounded at the door, softer than the night before, but just as unexpected. Sarah stood, her steps steady as she moved toward it, opening it to find two people standing there, neatly dressed, holding boxes, their expressions professional but kind. "Delivery for Ms. Carter," one of them said, and in that moment the promise made the night before stepped fully into reality, not just as words, but as action, as continuity, as something that extended beyond a single act of kindness into something lasting, something intentional. Sarah stepped aside, allowing them in, her eyes moving briefly to Lily, who stood quietly in the doorway of the living room, watching, understanding without needing explanation that what had begun with a single message had become something larger than that moment, something that would carry forward into days she could not yet see but could now believe in. And as the boxes were set down, filling the small space with more than just supplies, filling it with relief, with possibility, with time, it became clear that sometimes the most powerful changes do not arrive with noise or recognition. They arrive quietly, through a door opened at the right moment, through a message answered when it could have been ignored, through a choice made not because it was required, but because it was right. And in that choice, lives that once moved separately begin to move forward with something shared, something unseen but undeniable, the understanding that even in a world divided by distance, one small act of kindness can bridge it, and once that bridge exists, it does not simply disappear. It remains, carrying forward the quiet truth that compassion does not need to be perfect to matter. It only needs to be present when it is needed most.